stronger position to fund projects worth billions of dollars in any sector. But unfortunately, it will be as if the euphoria has been short-lived, as 3 years after the banking consolidation, the global financial crisis also touched Nigeria's financial sector as hard as the rest of the world. Then, the central bank governor, Sanusi Lamido, of course, is the MF Kanun, now was just appointed the central bank governor.
Well, Blessed, not exactly the global financial crisis that hit Nigeria. It arose on account of the consequences of the use of margin loans and insider dealings by the banks, which of course led to the collapse of the Nigerian stock market in the year 2008. The global financial crisis, of course, then also compounded issues. But as you rightly said, when the late President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua then appointed Sanusi Lamido as the governor of the central bank, they immediately commissioned a special examination of all 24 banks in the country, and it was discovered the capital inadequacy and liquidity requirements of a number of the banks necessitated the CBN rescue of 9 of those banks that were on the verge of failure. This was, of course, to reduce the impact on the country. Now, the rescue was also followed by the dismissal of the chief executives of those ailing banks on account of mismanagement. Now, those reforms, of course, were in some cases described as a Sanusi tsunami.
Well, now Central Bank Governor Godwin Emefiele has pledged another recapitalization of banks during his second term in the next 5 years, saying the one done by Professor Charles Soludo in 2004 was no longer realistic with the current devaluation of the Naira, as well as some other reasons that were advanced.
Well, if it is the value of the Naira, well, we don't have to ask ourselves what the value was in 2000 and 2005. I'm sure the rate hovered around 100. I'm not quite sure of the numbers now.
150.
That's right, which means that 25 billion Naira, as at that time, was equivalent to some 200 million US dollars. It made some sense then, as the CBN governor, the incumbent Emefiele, has compared it with today's exchange rate of well over 300 Naira to $1 US, which has now brought the bank capital as low as 75 million US dollars.
CBN Governor Emefiele also said repositioning the bank through recapitalization will increase the banking sector's capacity to take on large transactions and reduce the impact of an economic crisis on the nation's financial system. And it also ensured Nigerian banks are among the top 500 banks in the world. But then, the recapitalization of 2004 left a good number of people out of jobs, even as CBN maintained the need to deepen the financial sector as well as reposition Nigerian economy for growth. So, what about the collateral damage of recapitalization? What impact did the last bank's recapitalization have on the economy?
Well, very pertinent questions you have raised there, Blessing. What, of course, is also pertinent to ask is what will be the new capital base in the recapitalization exercise being contemplated by the central bank as part of the agenda of the CBN governor during his second tenure. And how many banks will be left standing when, of course, the deadline is crossed with regard to the new capital adequacy ratio? What will be the impact of all of this? These are the issues that our guests will be taking a look at today on Good Morning Nigeria. Very first day of the month of July 2019. We'd like to thank you for tuning in. My name is Kingsley Osadolo.
My name is Blessed Nabu. It's always good to have you join us on Good Morning Nigeria. This is broadcast live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA. We're live from Abuja, Nigeria's beautiful capital. It's a bright weather, and I'm sure it's going to be a great day. Well, the complimentary part of the program will come to you as well. Newspaper review, we'll take a look at business, sports, as well as entertainment news. Let's take the news highlights with Kendi Olaleye. Good morning, Kendi.
Good morning, Blessing and Kingsley, and here is the news. At the close of the 55th summit of the ECOWAS heads of state and government in Abuja, the decisions relating to single currency, political stability, peace and security were adopted. President Muhammadu Buhari also handed over the chairmanship of the ECOWAS to President Yusufu Ahmadu of Niger Republic.
The authority instructs the ECOWAS Commission and central banks to accelerate operationalization of the special fund for financing of programs in the revised roadmap for ECOWAS single currency program. It further directs the Commission to ensure implementation of the recommendations of the meeting of Ministerial Committee on ECOWAS single currency program.
The presidency has drawn attention to the recent unhelpful comment on government's plan to establish a Ruga settlement as a means of resolving clashes between farmers and cattle herders. In a statement by the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Media and Publicity, Galba Shehu, the presidency clarifies that Ruga settlement would settle animal farmers in an organized place with the provision of basic amenities and manufacturing facilities to add value to the meat. Not only is it open to all Nigerians, irrespective of tribe, the 12 states who have so far keyed into the initiative show that the federal government has no ulterior motive on the issue. The presidency calls for the cooperation of all Nigerians as it finds a peaceful and lasting solution to the crisis. There's been a leap in the poverty alleviation program of the federal government with empowerment of 836 youth and women from the 36 states of the Federation and FCT. 786 youth were trained on vocational skills, while 50 women were trained as artisans in various fields by the federal government at the National Women Development Center.
Became very necessary and important given the changing world of work.
I thank you for government for making this opportunity for us, because what I learned here, I can impact it to other people.
They are training most men do. So we here as the female, we are here to stand to let them know what a man can do, a woman can do better.
It is important whether you are a man or a woman to live your life to achieve the highest potential in whichever field.
Federal government's resolve that children acquire basic and quality education is sacrosanct. Head of the Civil Service of the Federation, Winifred Oyo-Ite, gave the assurance while inspecting LEA Primary School at the Public Service Institute of Nigeria.
Now that peace has been restored to Maiduguri and its environs, rehabilitating the FTC Maiduguri, we're going to now bring in very new initiatives. The children have to have the opportunities for education within the immediate campus environment.
When we started newly, we have only 5 teachers. They posted 20 Empower staff to the school, and we will remain grateful to the government of President Muhammadu Buhari.
And now to agriculture. In line with the Buhari administration policy of returning Nigeria to a position of agriculture-based, export-based country, Governor Muhammadu Inuwa Yahaya of Gombe State has procured and distributed a large quantity of fertilizers to farmers in the state.
Considering the high cost of fertilizer and seed in the markets, and the need to support our farmers, we have further subsidized the cost in line with the Buhari administration's policy aimed at making fertilizer affordable to the peasant farmers.
Still staying with agriculture, efforts are underway for Nigeria to commence the export of milled and rice paddy to neighboring countries. This is coming as some farmers from some African countries, including Ghana, Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire, look forward to learning from Nigeria's Rice Revolution initiative.
Input is being distributed to farmers for wet season. Data of farmers ranging from their farms and their biometric is being captured across the country. Nigeria is doing very fine and very well. Most of the countries are even copy from what we are doing in the country in Nigeria.
And that concludes the news for now. Good Morning Nigeria continues with Kingsley and Blessing after this break. Don't go away.
One football confederation, 24 teams, 6 stadiums, 4 cities, 504 African stars, 1 trophy. The Africa Cup of Nations Egypt 2019 comes alive from June 21 with the showpiece final on July 19, 2019. Watch the 52 matches of the tournament live on Africa's biggest and largest television network, NTA, in partnership with Hot Sports. Be part of the biggest soccer fiesta in the African continent as the Super Eagles go on a bold mission to clinch the prestigious title for the 4th time, to the excitement of millions of fans across the length and breadth of Nigeria. Nigeria's premier sports production and marketing group, Hot Sports, partners with the biggest, the largest, and the #1 television network in Africa, the NTA, to give Nigerians a memorable viewing experience. Boost fan support for the Super Eagles to glory in Egypt. For inquiries, please contact Abubakar on 0803-331-0175 and Felix on 0803-308-2375. NTA, you can't beat the rich.
They are there at the crack of dawn. They are there busy preparing while we rise for our day. They are there silently, guarding, waiting, listening, and watching. They are there ready in the sky above and the waters below, in the blistering heat of the day, in the dead of night, willing, indefatigable, determined in the defense of the sovereignty of our country. They are our first line of defense and our last. They who have paid the ultimate price in defending us. They are fathers and uncles. They are mothers and sisters and girlfriends and boyfriends. They are brothers and cousins and best friends and neighbors. They are classmates, colleagues, and citizens of this nation. They are our defenders and deserve our respect, our prayers, our thoughts. Nigeria, please support our armed forces.
NTA Television College Jos announces admissions into 2-year diploma programs in film and television production, television engineering, and broadcast journalism. The sale of forms will commence on the 13th of May and run through 30th July 2019. Admission forms can be obtained from all marketing offices, NTA state capital stations, zonal centers, or at the office of the academic secretary, NTA Television College, Rayfield, Jos.
On payment of a non-refundable fee of 7,500 naira in bank draft in favor of NTA TV College. Applicants can also obtain the forms through the NTA TV College portal at www.ntatvc.edu.nj.
Applicants are required to possess 5 credits in GCE or SSCE in relevant areas of study in not more than 2 sittings, including English and mathematics. All properly completed forms attached with photocopies of credentials must be submitted on or before 30th July 2019. For further inquiries, please visit our website at ntatvc.com or call 0803-3144-383.
NTA TV College, training you to be the best you want to be.
Registrar, Announcer.
All right, you're still watching Good Morning Nigeria, reaching you on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. Now, time for us to take some business stories, and here is our correspondent, Kolo Mohammed.
Good morning, and good to have you join us on Business News. The national economy is visibly gaining some traction. In particular, increased credit provision and the implementation of the minimum wage will lend support to the consumer demand and the non-oil segment of the economy. This development is, however, not seen by many. A development expert had a chat with NTA Business News crew in Abuja.
I think Nigeria is actually making progress. As you said, sometimes we don't see it. One of the areas that progress is being made is in infrastructure, because we need to deal with the issue of infrastructure deficit on roads, on power, on energy, and so on and so forth. I see this government doing a lot in that area. So if we deal with the problem of infrastructure, which is the starting point, it will create avenues for other technologies to come in. So what this country needs to leapfrog is technology. We don't need to start from the scratch. First, let me say that there's a lot, there abounds a lot of knowledge already in Nigeria, which we need to harness, especially the youth. Okay, the youth have a lot to offer. We have so many universities, so knowledge is there, but we need to harness them, and we need to tap in the technologies that exist in addition to what we're already doing. That's what Japan has done. That's what China has done. They tap from US, from wherever, and they add their own, and they're where they are today. Nigeria is on that path already, and I believe that we can get to where we want to be if we begin to harness our own strength and our own technologies.
And similarly, the federal government is set to offset a 10-year-old export expansion grant running into billions of naira. This means recovery and stability for the economy, according to a stakeholder.
I read recently that the panel set up by the government on the African free trade has submitted a positive report, and Nigeria and the president will assent to this very soon. So this gladdens my mind because we need to integrate with the rest of Africa. We need to start exporting to African countries. And then if we make progress, then we can look outwards. So what the government is doing to encourage export is in the right direction, because we need the foreign exchange and we need the vertical integration that will now make producers to do more, bring the raw material that will feed the industry that will be converted into exports. So this is in the right direction.
It is beginning of the week. Regulators and players are bracing up to open proceedings for the week on the floor of the Nigerian stock market. As always, NTA Business News will bring you outcome of proceedings when the market closes later today. That's it on Business News at this time. See you again soon.
Thank you very much, Kolo Mohammed, for the business package. Up next for us is a newspaper segment.
Newspaper reviewer Bayo Atoyebe is with us in the studios. Bayo, good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Kinsley. Good morning. Good morning, Blessing. Good morning, Nigeria.
All right. I hope you had a pleasant weekend.
Yes, I did. Except for the shock match between the Bears of Madagascar. And again, it goes to prove that there are no minions in African football. And we took them for granted, and they shocked us. Two distinct errors, and clearly, Super Eagles. Even the Madagascans were surprised that they beat Super Eagles. They surprised themselves.
But the Eagles they were lumbering on the pitch. I was wondering whether they ate some double dose of pounded yam 30 minutes before the match started.
The best way to describe them is what Fanny Amu once said: wobbling and fumbling.
Yeah. Well, of course, they've qualified for the next round, and let's say that's the knockout stages, the second round.
Likely to meet Ghana Black Star.
Yeah, you saw the match between Ghana and Cameroon. Yes. That is a real cracker of, of a game. So let's hope for the very best and remainder of participation in the African Cup of Nations. Let's begin this morning by taking a look at the Nigerian Tribune. Nigerian Tribune, above the nameplate, we have the following headlines. National Grid suffers another collapse as TCN, that's Transmission Company of Nigeria, blames incident on high voltage. That story continues on page 10. June 12, how NADECO was formed. That story is attributed to Oshoba. And then coming to stories below the nameplate, the lead story, by the way, now. No land for Ruga settlement in southeast. And that's according to the governors from that geopolitical zone of the country. With 3 riders, that's plan for Ruga settlement, provocative and repugnant, southern and middle belt leaders. Presidency explains rationale for scheme, says it's voluntary and that 12 states have already applied. That story is in greater detail on page 2. ECOWAS moves to adopt single currency, page 9. Atiku files 2.5 billion naira libel suit against Buhari's aide. That's Loretta Onoche. Details of that story on page 30. 3 arrested as police deploy security in Kaduna burnt church. That's on page 31. The photograph there shows protesters at the Commonwealth of Zion Assembly, that's COZA, in Guzape, Abuja, yesterday, Sunday. And the headline immediately below it also relates to that with a kicker. Alleged rape. Protests rock COZA, Abuja, and Lagos churches. With a number of riders there, Fatoyinbo cancels annual program, says elders looking into allegations. My husband never raped anyone. That's Fatoyinbo's wife. And lawyers and Serap one pastor investigated. That's always in greater detail on page 7. Listen.
Okay, I'll kick off with a story on the presidency talking about the Ruga settlement. That's the lead story for Daily Trust. Why federal government is establishing Ruga settlements from the presidency. Then the deal there, the writer there, I beg your pardon, says our deal with herders by Southeast governors. starts right there but continues on page 5. The photograph we have there is of rescue officials from the Lagos State Emergency Management Agency, LASEMA, at the scene of a boat mishap at Ipako Boat Jetty in Egbe, in Korodu, Lagos State on Saturday. 2 bodies were retrieved and 3 others rescued. And the boat was said to be carrying about 21 persons. Okay, quickly now to the Punch newspaper. States, local governments neglect leaves primary health centers in ruins. That's on page 2. But you have the photograph of some of the health centers in their deplorable state. Okay, just below the photograph, we have other stories. Benue Church members arrest suspected robber during service. That's on page 8. Power grid suffers total collapse. More details about that on page 44. And other stories now. Truck crushes 5 to death on Bauchi Jos Road. Okay, the story Kingsley read from his paper. Atiku files 2.5 billion naira libel suit against Buhari's aide Onochela as Loretta Onachena. It's trending on page 12. Bayo.
Yes, let's throw some light on the subject of Ruga. The Southeast Governors Forum says it has no plan for Ruga settlement. In the statement issued in Abakaliki, Governor Dave Umahi, who is the chairman of the Southeast Governors Forum, said Southeast Zone, including the South-South, have no Ruga settlement plans. The statement is cited the Southeast as agrarian region faced with limited land for farming and cannot accommodate any Ruga settlement. The governor, who was chairman of the National Economic Council Sub-Technical Committee for Farmers and Header Clash, he says his committee recommended revamping grazing reserves in the north. All cattle rearers in the south will take their cattle to reserves in the north, and then they will rely on grass grown in the south. He explains how it works. He says herders will bring down their cows to the southeast to sell meat. The same trailer which transport these cows will now load grasses grown in the southeast and transport the grass to the cattle in the cattle grazing reserves in the north. By this, herdsmen will embrace what he described as trade by barter, selling cows and buying grass to feed cows in the north. He, however, called on tolerance among the youth, especially for ethnic nationalities, as a solution to hate speech, especially among Igbo youth. However, the federal government has also explained that, that there is a need to provide clarification on Ruga settlement. He says it is not attempt to seize land belonging to state government. Rather, it seeks to settle migrant pastoral families. Garba Shehu, spokesman for the president, said it is a rural settlement in which animal farmers, not just cattle herders, are settled in organized place. The place will have basic amenities such as schools, hospitals, roads network, veterinary clinics, and market. This will enable the processing and added value to meat and animal products. He says the federal government intends to curb open grazing that continues to pose security threat among the nation. Other gains are job creation, access to credit, security, and pastoral families, and also the curtailment of cattle rustling. He says the program is voluntary, and 12 states have already applied. He says there is no plan to seize land belonging to state government. He adds, however, it is a fact that the federal government has gazetted lands in all states, but because the idea is voluntary, government has limited the takeoff to the dozen states that have requested. So those who have volunteered to be part of it will be part of the Ruga settlement, and there's no compulsion in it. And so we hope that has clarified the both perspective from the Governors Forum, particularly Southeast and South-South, and also the federal government position. Meanwhile, the Sultan of Sokoto has enjoined against the danger in giving security challenges in the country ethnic correlation. The Sultan, Syed Abubakar, said, ethnic embellishment can spark ethnic crisis. He therefore enjoined well-meaning Nigerians to join hands and put an end to insecurity in the country. He charged religious leaders to disabuse the minds of the youth, particularly, and the Sultan was represented by Professor Dawood Obe at the opening of a church in Iwo in Osun State.
All right, Bayo, thanks a lot. I'm sure over the weekend you must have seen the flurry of comments and reactions over the Ruga settlement and, of course, the clarifications that have come on. But let's move on now and take other stories. Nigerian pilot, below the nameplate, you have two headlines we will take from there. Suspected extremists set Catholic church ablaze in Kaduna. That's page 12. Another headline says, debtors owe AMCON 5 trillion naira. CJ laments. That's page 6. Now, just below the photograph there on the front page, you have this headline with greater detail of the story on page 8. It says, INEC server. Legal battle shifts to Supreme Court and parties in dispute jittery over likely judgment. INEC under pressure to tamper with election materials. That's attributed to the PDP. Now, you have also a window of headlines just at the foot of the front page of the paper. EFCC Chair Magu begged me for confirmation. Saraki reveals. That's the allegation. Details on page 5. And on page 7, Okorocha fights back, accuses Ihedioha of invasion of privacy. And on page 6, Serap warns security agencies against arrest of anti-sex protesters and asks Orji Kalu, that's Serap now, asking Orji Kalu, Goje and others to stop collecting pension. Details on page 6. And court orders civil defense to reinstate and pay 90 officials their entitlements. And lastly, Nigeria's export declines to 4.5 trillion naira in Q1 2019. Declining from what figure? Details on page 12. Lesson.
Okay, except I go into, but there was a lead story for the Punch I talked about.
Yeah, primary health care.
Yes.
Primary health care is a challenge. You recall that the other day, the Minister of Health also expressed serious concern that tertiary hospitals are being belabored by instances of ailments that only primary health care should take over. But what is the state of the primary health care? From all reports, there are reports from various states of the Federation. Exactly. One indicates that in Oyo State, for instance, you have 23 doctors manning 800 primary health care. How do you manage that? And in Enugu, it is reported that reptiles, snakes, because the place has been overgrown by weeds, you have snakes and other reptiles have taken over the primary health care. And the federal government had a good plan for primary health care. All across the nation, in local governments, primary health care have been constructed. The structure is there, the physical structure is there, but there are no facilities, there are no doctors. And that is a big challenge, and that is why there's still a vacuum. And one of the lamentations of that publication by Punch is that women are now forced to patronize birth attendants. So those are the challenges. However, there's also some tremendous achievement in the area of security. In Zamfara State, the initiative by the state government for amnesty is yielding results. Governor Bello Mutawale was briefing General Yakubu Gowon, who was visiting, that in the meantime, repentant bandits have surrendered 216 rifles, mostly AK-47. Most of the weapons were voluntarily returned by the repentant bandits who have now embraced peace. It may be recalled that there is an operation Hadarin Daji, and the commander gave 48 hours notice to all bandits to surrender or face extinction. And now that is yielding results. You also recall that some time ago, the state government offered money for arms. That also led to the surrender of some arms. But the General Gowon is in the Zamfara State in pursuance of Nigeria prays. And he says that we should continue to pray to see an end to violence. And in Kaduna State, the police in Kaduna have arrested a 32-year-old soldier for allegedly selling ammunition to kidnappers. The soldier is a lance corporal and is alleged to be serving at the cantonment in Jaji. He is reported to have sold each ammunition to the bandits at 400 naira. And he says, well, he did not know that the customers were kidnappers. He actually sold it to the customer because he said they needed the bullets to protect their cattle from being rustled. The Commissioner of Police, Ali Janga, also paraded 62 other suspects arrested for kidnapping and armed banditry. So they are actually all falling into the dragnet of the security agencies.
All right, just before you take the editorial, there was this story, this headline I read earlier from the front page of the Nigerian Pilot, right at the foot of the front page. It says Nigeria's export declines to 4.5 trillion naira in Q1 2019, and I'd asked for the comparative basis for that headline. Details of the story are on page 12. And unfortunately, the figures are taken from a report of the National Bureau of Statistics, but I think it's just a play by either the sub-editor or production sub-editor, because the story kicks off, says, a report from the National Bureau of Statistics has shown that the country's export fell by 3.9% in the first quarter of this year compared to the same period in 2018. But the report also continues and says the NBS data showed that the country's total export was valued at 4.5 trillion naira in 2019, representing a 1.7% rise compared to the fourth quarter of 2018. So the decline is year on year. If you say that, in the first quarter of 2018, first quarter of 2019. But again, the crucial aspect, according to the story here on page 12, it says the trade balance, that's Nigeria's trade balance, remained positive at over 380 billion naira in Q1, boosted by increase in both exports and imports.
Let's go to the editorial. The editorial is coming from the Blueprint, and it's on the rampant incidents of rape. So in the past 1 year, incidents of rape have assumed a worrisome dimension. Although rape is a global phenomenon, hardly does a day go by without the Nigerian media reporting, just as we've seen one here now. Case of rape involving young and old men, women, toddlers, and the underage are not spared. In fact, the minors have become the soft target of these sick characters, as been described.
Well, the latest current one is allegations of rape against a cleric said to have been committed 20 years ago, and it has generated a lot of furore. On one hand, protesters are demanding justice for the alleged victim, who is now the spouse of a musician. The church has now been forced to cancel its annual program, which was supposed to last for 7 days. However, they are now to resort to 7 days of fasting. At the church, the cleric is being eulogized by female members of the church testifying to his integrity. Outside the church, the cleric is being heckled by protesters, mainly women, outside, demanding justice and that the pastor should also step down. Now, coming to the editorial. The editorial is pointing out to the fact that hardly any day passes this day without one story of rape or the other being published. And it is pointing out that it has become rampant. And one begins to wonder what has become of our society. In fact, the editorial observed that in May last year could have been described as the month of rape. It says that most of the stories about rape happened in that part of the year last year. And some of the instances are very sad. You have a 19-year-old in Katsina raping a 10-year-old girl. You have 2 teenagers in Abeokuta gang raping a 14-year-old girl. A 48-year-old man in Lagos raping a 10-year-old girl. There are instances of even infants being falling victims of rape. You begin to wonder, what is the state of the mind of the people who are committing this? You will recall about students, involving university students, who adopted a colleague and gang raped the colleague. And so the editorial is saying that this has become a social menace, and there is the desperate need to find immediate solution to
Sometimes it's even worrisome when it's the case of even those who are supposed to be protecting the people. We've had cases of some law enforcement agency.
Yes. In fact, the editorial
agents
points
as well.
out to one that there are women in custody that are allegedly being raped by the person who are supposed to protect them from custody.
Yeah, Bayo, thanks. I mean, what needs to be done also is to arrest, speedily try persons who are alleged to have committed these offences. This, so one will not, of course, it's a serious offence, so you cannot say get summary trial. But whatever else will obstruct justice in this case, should be cleared expeditiously and let them have their day in court and, of course, as some would say, rot in jail.
Yes. There's also a problem with rape. There is a social stigma attached to rape. And therefore, most often than not, victims are very reluctant to come out.
Exactly.
Yeah, but in cases where they do come out, prosecute them speedily.
We should encourage them to come out and stop stigmatizing them so that these criminals can be put under bars. Yes.
Victims. Bayo, thank you for being around. Of course, June and July this year have been and will be, sporting months. We still have the Cup of Nations going on, and today, of course, Wimbledon opens.
Yes.
In Southwest London.
Tennis on grass.
Yes, tennis on grass. It's the third Grand Slam of the year. My girls are also there, but they are aging now. So
young girls are coming. Young girls are coming.
Young girls are coming.
Daughters are coming.
Yes, our daughters are coming.
Yes.
All right, Bayo, thank
you.
you for being around. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, it's Good Morning Nigeria, live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll be dealing with the new proposal by the CBN to recapitalize commercial banks in Nigeria.
Do you desire to master new techniques and technologies of camera operations? Then you must attend NTA TV College Special 4-week intensive course on modern camera operation techniques. The course is designed for cameramen in private and public television stations, ministries, departments, agencies, and faith-based organizations. Take advantage of the course to upgrade your professional skills in single and multi-camera operations within just 4 weeks. Also, a special course on intermediate online news reporting skills for journalists, multimedia producers, and freelance reporters will run concurrently. Take advantage of NTA TV College's special 4-week course on online news reporting to upscale your capacity in computer-assisted reporting, social media content production strategies, online media platforms for dissemination of information, and much more. The venue for both courses is the serene and secure environment of NTA Television College, near Old Government House, Rayfield, Jos, Plateau State. Date 8th July to 2nd August 2019. Course fee 100,000 naira only per participant. Accommodation inclusive. For more information, please call 0803-314-4383 or 0806-980-9807. NTA Television College, Jos, training you to be the best you want to be.
One Football Confederation, 24 teams, 6 stadiums, 4 cities, 504 African stars, 1 trophy. The Africa Cup of Nations Egypt 2019 comes alive from June 21 with the showpiece final on July 19, 2019. Watch the 52 matches of the tournament live on Africa's biggest and largest television network, NTA, in partnership with Hot Sports. Be part of the biggest soccer fiesta in the African continent as the Super Eagles go on a bold mission to clinch the prestigious title for the 4th time, to the excitement of millions of fans across the length and breadth of Nigeria. For inquiries, please contact Abubakar on 0803-331-0175 and Felix on 0803-308-2375. NTA, you can't beat the rich.
You're still watching Good Morning Nigeria on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA. Now to set a tone for our discussion this morning on the proposed bank recapitalization by Central Bank of Nigeria. Oyeyemi Ajayi has put together this introductory package.
Bank recapitalization means reinvesting in banks with new capital to improve their balance sheets. The recapitalization becomes necessary when bank liabilities are higher than their assets. The liquidity with banks is a liability, as it is the money deposited by customers, which needs to be paid sooner or later. Due to this, their balance sheet weakens and banks find it difficult to raise capital from the open market. And this is where the government, also referred to as the biggest shareholder, can infuse capital in banks by either buying new shares or by issuing bonds. In 2004, the then governor of the central bank, Professor Charles Soludo, introduced measures that will reduce the exposure and enhance the stability of the nation's financial system, in order to strengthen and reposition the existing banks and putting new ones on a good startup. This was why 25 billion naira capital base was injected from 2 billion naira. This resulted in the fold-up of some banks and merging of others, renewing the confidence of customers and investing on Nigerian banks. This action was seen as the right step, believed to have transformed the country's banking sector for the better, stabilizing the country's overall economy. 15 years later, talks about recapitalization is resurfacing. At the recent media briefing, while reading out plans for the next 5 years of his second tenure, the governor of Nigeria's Apex Bank, Godwin Emefiele, echoed the need for recapitalization again, saying the Nigerian banks need to be among the top 500 in the world. Emefiele said that then bank recapitalization has been weakened and therefore the need to reposition the Nigerian banks becomes imminent. Now, with this plan, where does it leave investors, customers and shareholders of banks? How does it affect the overall economy? And are Nigerians to expect another tsunami of banks merging, with some folding up? Guest on NTA's Good Morning Nigeria will be providing answers shortly.
Thank you very much, Oyeyemi Ajayi. We have our guest seated already. We'd like to welcome to the studio. Professor Uche Waleke is the chairman, Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria, Abuja branch. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And we have joining us from our Kaduna Center, we'd like to welcome Dr. Zubair Tajo Abdullah of the Department of Economics, Kaduna State University. Dr. Tajo, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Nigeria. Good morning to you too.
All right. We also have guests at our network centers that will be joining us in the course of the conversation. We hope we clear the lines to those centers. Well, let's begin with Professor Uche Waleke, of course, who's a regular guest on Good Morning Nigeria. Our background report did touch on recapitalization. Let's break it down for the benefit of some of our viewers. Recapitalizing means that you already have capital. What is a bank's capital, and why is it necessary for the CBN to keep an eye on the capital of a bank?
Yes, thank you very much. When you say capital, of course you mean you could say the money that the bank is using, to act as a buffer. And that capital is usually contributed by the shareholders. So we have ordinary share capital, okay? And when the central bank talks about recapitalization, the central bank is not just focusing on capital. That's share capital. The share capital can, of course, be of different forms. You have ordinary share capital. You also have the one that's called preference share capital, okay? And it's not just the share capital that the central bank is really concerned with. The central bank is concerned with what is called shareholders' funds. So shareholders' funds is a composition of not just the share capital, but also the reserves of a bank. So your capital plus your reserves, should be up to a certain level for you to be able to function, properly. Remember, banks are in the business of financial intermediation. They mobilize funds from what we call surplus units and they channel to deficit units. Okay? In other words, they get funds from savers and they use those funds for lending. So traditionally, that is the main function of a bank. And for a bank to do that, seamlessly, okay, for a bank not to have the temptation of, making away with depositors' funds, because deposits with the banks are obligations of the banks to their customers. The bank needs, that bank needs to have sufficient buffer, sufficient capital to be able to withstand any shock, and that is why there is need to, increase the capital base of banks, okay, to make sure that the bank is in a position to do that. And if a bank doesn't have enough capital, the bank again is not in a position, is in a weak position in terms of lending, because there is what is called, for example, the part of the prudential guidelines is what is called the single obligor limit. It's one of the risk management tools that the central bank puts in place. Single obligor limit means that there's a limit to the lending that you can do. So today it's about 20%. So if a bank's capital is, say, 30 billion, remember I talked about share capital and reserve. So if the share capital is, say, 25 billion, the minimum, and you have reserves of 5 billion, that means the shareholders' funds is 30 billion. Okay, what you can lend is subject to 6, from what I've just described now, 6 billion. So if your share capital and reserves is 30 billion and single obligor limit is 30%, that means the maximum you can put out there is 6 billion. And look at it in today's Nigeria, what projects can 6 billion really finance? Okay, we are talking about banks that should be in a position to finance development projects. 6 billion, if you take that in dollar terms, because most of these development projects are dollar denominated. So if you take that in dollar terms, it's really small. So such a bank may not be in a position to finance projects, big ticket projects in, say, the oil and gas sector, in, say, the telecom sector, in, say, the power sector. And these are sectors that, were required to drive growth and development, in the economy. And what usually happens is a case of where a bank is unable to do so. You find banks syndicating. And of course, loan syndication comes with its own costs, associated costs. It's more expensive. There are delays associated with it. So it's better for our banks to be, strong. If you look at the situation in 2004, recall that in 2004, in July precisely, the then CBN governor, Professor Charles Soludo, also came up with this consolidation. Okay, what was the background at the time? We had tiny, fragmented banks, all over the place. 89 of them, that couldn't really make significant contributions, in the economy. So Soludo came up with this policy. So at the end of the day, over a period of 18 months, by December 2005, we had 25 banks that were stronger. The same situation is also playing out now. Okay, you have a banking sector where just a few banks control, say, over 70% of bank assets. If you take out the big 5, okay, if you take out the likes of First Bank, UBA, Zenith, GTB, okay, and Access. If you take out these first 5, you can see that the banking sector, collapses. So from that fragmented structure to a bigger structure where you have banks that can rank, at least internationally, that can compete in the international space. If you look at the ranking of banks in the world, there's no Nigerian bank that ranks among the first 500. Okay, I want to even quote the CBN Governor Soludo in the speech that he made. None. There's a single bank in South Africa, the South African Standard Bank, okay, has assets that, if you compare the assets of that bank to all the ones we have in Nigeria put together, that one alone is greater than the ones we have in Nigeria. So in a situation like that, our banks cannot compete internationally. And that's why, in my view, I think what the central bank has done, the central bank is not saying, as we saw in the last time, over a short period of time, central bank is saying over the next 5 years. So it's just a signal. It's just for you to begin to get ready, to prepare. And let me also say this. What I'm going to say is evidence-based, because I've had the privilege of supervising many, some, MSc, PhD work, on this matter. Because since 2005, we've had a number of studies on the impact of consolidation, on the banking sector. And following the ones I've supervised, I can tell you that the preponderant view is that consolidation has really helped to bring about stability in the financial sector. And usually what they do, quickly, is to look at pre-consolidation period, post-consolidation period, and look, spotlight a few financial indicators, such as non-performing loans, cost-to-income ratio in terms of efficiency, return on assets. Okay, so they look at include capital adequacy ratio. So they look at all this and then come to the conclusion that it has really, yes.
All right,
been
thank you very
worthwhile.
much, Professor Waleki. Yes, well, let's get back to our Kaduna Center where we earlier introduced Dr. Zubair Tajo Abdullah. It will appear 15 years after we had the last recapitalization for the financial sector, that's the banking sector, the fragility as well as the vulnerability is not ready to leave the sector in a hurry. What are your views?
Very much. As the honorable distinguished professor has indicated earlier, there were internal problems. First, with the value of money. You see, money has a time value. You have 1,000 naira today. Its value in the next 2-3 months will not be the same. So if you want to buy something, if you want the purchasing power of that 1,000 naira to be the same, it means 3 months from now, you have to increase a certain amount, because within 3 months, inflation would have done away with a significant part of the value of the money. So the purchasing power will not be the same. That is one particular reason that led to the erosion of the capital base, inflation. The second one is the naira-dollar parity. And as the central bank governor indicated in his submission, the fact of the matter was that during Soludo, when the last recapitalization commenced, the value of the dollar was about 100 naira. Now it is about 360 or 65 naira. And that is another source of erosion. So the very definition of recapitalization, implicit in it, is the fact that a return to the required capital base or former capital base, or an increase in the value of the capital base. This is it. The short history is that over the last 15 years, the Nigerian naira has lost a chunk of its value, partly due to inflation, and secondly due to the change in the parity between the naira and the dollar. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Zubair Abdullah, thank you for your opening comments, but I still want to stay with you before we come back to Professor Owaleke with us in the studios. Is the comparison in terms of the value of the assets of banks, say 2005 when the last recap exercise was done, versus what we are seeing today on account, one, of inflation, and secondly, the exchange rate of the naira to the US dollar. Are bank assets only in cash? We have also seen, for instance, that some financial institutions have assets other than cash, and those assets would have grown in value on account of the rise in inflation. A property that you acquired, say, 15 years ago, if you were to go to revalue it today, will certainly be several times higher. So what is the basis of comparison? Is it just merely absolute or what?
The accountants will take the nominal value. The economists will look at the effect of inflation on whatever the value of the asset is. Alternatively, you can look at the replacement cost. If you have invested 100 million in a project or in a building, an edifice, and 10 years on, its value has risen to, let's say, 150 million. Then, there is a gain. But by the time you take that 150 million and actually divided it by the rate of inflation, what will you get? That's another pointer or another partial answer to what you are saying. But it is true. Banks do have physical, tangible assets on the one hand, and they have also financial assets made up of loans, advances, investments, and the like. But these are the main sources of their income. These investments, loans, and advances, they are risk assets, but they generate a lot of income for the banks. Recapitalizing the bank will strengthen them for the future in terms of new investments, new loans to be granted, new opportunities, seizing new opportunities in other horizons within the economy, so that overall their profitability will be enhanced as a result of recapitalization, sir. I hope I am fairly clear. But if there is ambiguity, please straighten me up.
Well, I'll give the opportunity, Dr. Abdallah, thank you. I'll give the opportunity to Professor Uche Waleke to also respond to the question. Waleke, you understood the question that I asked. Yes. Namely, if banks have assets, the assets that they have acquired since 2005, obviously will also have grown in value. Banks also have investments, not just in Naira, but some of them have investments offshore. So if you were to dollarize all of this, I would therefore be looking at an absolutely value to say, oh, the capital base is still 25 billion, or their shareholder funds is...
Your risk. He also talked about improvement in non-performing loan ratio, okay, from 15% to about 9% now. Now, the point is, if you look at those improvements, recorded in those performance indicators, they are mainly associated with these big banks. So there is still something about scale, okay? Many of the banks that are smaller in size, if you like, the tier 2, tier 3 banks, are banks that are, known for these huge non-performing loans. Okay, so you find that studies have even shown that there's a strong correlation between scale and banking performance, because a big bank is in a stronger position to put in place, risk management measures. A big bank is in a stronger position to diversify, its assets. So if you look at the cases of corporate governance issues and many of these infractions, okay, you would find that they're associated with some of these other banks. So there is something about scale, no doubt. So when you talk about assets of banks, really, yes, there are. You could talk about buildings as fiscal assets, but loans and advances represent assets of banks. Yes, and as I said earlier on, the building, the bank building you're using for your operations, yes, of course, it's an asset, but it's not generating any, revenue for you, except you have leased it out or leased out, parts of it. So the main thing remains loans and advances, and that is why when it comes to the issue of capital, when we say capital, we don't include those ones. We don't have a case of revaluation. And that is why the central bank says the recognized routes are either through mergers and acquisitions or through fresh injection of capital from the capital market. In 2005, if you recall, we saw significant improvements in capital market activity, following the recapitalization. Over 400 billion naira, I recall, was raised from the capital market. The primary market was very active. We saw a lot of IPOs. We saw a lot of rights issues, from banks. And over the next 5 years, okay, now that yes, I also foresee that happening because the market requires a trigger, and this is one trigger I see also, coming. So if banks can approach the market to raise more money, and those that cannot will submit themselves for major, arrangements, okay, that will be fine. The last time we met, I talked about a situation where, a bank can even identify, a smaller bank can identify a bigger bank what we call in finance a white knight, a friendly investor to, to take it over. Okay. In 2004, when we had 89 banks, remember that not all of them, were part of the consolidation. Yes, some of them could not be, consolidated, but now we have, 20-something, it's manageable. So at the end of the day, if we have a few banks that are strong, that are even in a position to key into the central bank's overall vision of using the banking sector, to drive growth. Okay, it may interest you to note that I was looking at the last GDP report, by the National Bureau of Statistics. The finance and insurance sector contributes just 3%, to GDP. And of course, this sector is still in the negative territory. And the sector is, of course, dominated by the banking sector. So for the banking sector to make meaningful contribution to the economy, we need, stronger banks.
Professor Waleke, yes. You use the statement for those banks that will be watching out, okay, they're strong, through whatever the parameters are to judge the healthy status. Now, in order not to scare customers and also will be investors even in the financial sector, what determines the healthy status of a bank or the viability? So for people to watch out, at least as watchers in the industry.
If you deposit money in the bank, for a customer, you deposit money in the bank, and each time you go to pull your money, there is no story. Or you approach a bank as a customer, you approach a bank for a facility, and you get that facility, okay? You tend to have confidence, in that bank, okay? Because the bank is meeting your needs, as it were. So for banks to be in a position to deliver, that is the point I'm making, okay? To meet the expectations, of their customers, okay? Those banks need to be, big and strong. If a bank is having liquidity issues, for example, okay, liquidity crisis, okay, that bank is likely, most likely to, find means of not rendering those services to their customers. Okay. Now, research has shown that only 10% of bank, customers, take advantage of many of the products that the banks, make available. So for us to achieve our target of financial inclusion, for us to have robust, payment system in partnership with fintech companies, we need banks that will have enough capital, enough money to invest in technology, to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I was wondering, Professor Waleke, I did mention that we're going to be joined by other guests from our network centers. This time we are going to our Benin Network Center, where Professor Mike Obadan, another regular guest on Good Morning Nigeria, is joining us. Professor Mike Obadan is a professor of economics and also a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Professor Obadan, pleasure to have you with us on the program.
Thank you very much, Kingsley. It's my pleasure to be with you.
All right, straight away, we've been on the subject now for the past 20-25 minutes. Let's just back up a bit. In 2004, 2005, when we had the last bank recapitalization exercise, it was almost used as a synonym that recapitalization was for the consolidation of commercial banks, because you had 89 commercial banks at the time. Some of them were no more than one building banks. You have found most of them on Awolowo Road in southwest Ikoyi. Now we later on had 25 banks. What is the purpose of the proposed recapitalization exercise moving on from 2019?
Thank you very much, Kingsley. I think the major aim of the planned recapitalization of banks is to strengthen the banks and reposition them to be able to perform their traditional function of intermediation. That is to say, serving as intermediary between the surplus funds unit in the economy and the deficit units. That is to say, those who have money and then those who want to borrow money. I see the planned action as a proactive and strategic move by the Central Bank of Nigeria. As the governor indicated, Governor of the Central Bank indicated in his press briefing, two major aims. One, to reposition, the banks and make them strong and big to be among the 500, banks in the world. And then secondly, to empower them, prepare them to be able to withstand any crisis, any economic crisis. In other words, perhaps, internal shocks, external shocks. And that derives from the central bank's appreciation of the importance of adequate capital, for banks. Capital is important or crucial for commercial banks, financial institutions. Actually, we cannot overemphasize the role of capital in the banking industry. Because of a number of roles which such capital plays, I will quickly outline them. Number one, capital serves as an essential element which enhances confidence and also enables, the banks to perform their traditional functions, within the industry. Very importantly, capital in a bank serves as a means of absorbing losses. I think this is very, very critical. Serves as a means of absorbing losses. In other words, capital serves as a buffer. And it can serve.
We create space for people to other new banks to come in, like what the central bank are doing recently. I know central bank listed new banks, and those new banks, some of them have started operations. They are winning customers. The key thing for me is that we must not close the window for entry in the competitive space. Otherwise, we will stifle competition, stifle innovation. If you cast your mind back, the banks that we are calling big banks today, the likes of Zenith, the likes of GT Bank, the likes of Access Bank, I mean modern Access Bank when I talk about Access Bank. If you take, for instance, Zenith and GT Bank, Zenith started in 1991. The top big banks then were Union Bank, First Bank, and UBA. Today, Zenith has more capital base or shareholders fund than those other three banks. In fact, Union Bank is even in a region of 220-something billion naira in shareholders fund, which is less than a third of what Zenith has today. Because there was a banking space that allowed new entrants. At that point, the Zenith Bank, the GT banks of this world, they were considered very small banks. They grew over time and they become the largest banks in the country. So we must leave a window for new entrants without coming up with a capital requirement that will make it impossible for new entrants to come into any economic space. And that's, for me, the concern. So the central bank, in coming up with a detailed guideline, should ensure that it's risk-based and not necessarily one-size-fits-all. Otherwise, you will be shutting out new entrants, you'll be shutting out creativity, you'll shutting out innovation in the economy. And interestingly, in most environments, it is the new startups that come up with innovation, which is what happened in the banking industry. If not for the entrance of the likes of GT Bank, Zenith Bank, Citizens Bank, Diamond Bank of those days, today we would have still be going to the bank with a mat. But those banks came and revolutionized service delivery. They were a small bank, they were looking for a niche to compete, and they looked at service quality as a competitive edge. And they now arose the giants to reform. If you shut out new entrants, you will kill innovation. So the central bank, in looking through or thinking through the process of recapitalization that you're going to come up with, the guidelines you're going to come up with, must be conscious of the fact that we must not stifle competition. We must allow for new entrants into the space, and to maintain financial system stability is not just about maintaining strong shareholder capital base. You must also have an economy that is expanding. You must have an economy that is creating opportunity for the banks to lend. You must have a sound regulatory framework that can nip in the bud deterioration in asset quality, that has such a oversight role that will compel banks to abide by the best corporate governance standards. So if we have these things, we're going to have a robust banking space that will have the big tier, big banks, the medium-sized banks, the family banks, but most importantly, everybody should have a space to enjoy financial service.
All right, thank you very much, Johnson Chukwu, there for your opening comments. You talked about family banks. I'm sure that some Nigerians will feel very squeamish about a return to the era of family banks, banks owned by Mr. and Mrs. or Mr. and Mrs. and sons. Of course, there are new corporate governance guidelines with regard to the financial institutions that forbid such institutions such as family banks as we had in the past. But your points are noted, in addition, of course, to what used to play out in the 80s and early 90s when people were going to the banks with their mats and expecting their tally number before they were served. Now, Johnson Chukwu, you raised a number of important points. I would like Professor Mike Obadan to respond to some of those points, namely that have we had a studied evaluation of what went right with the consolidation of 2004-2005, and also what went wrong, and therefore appropriate lessons that could be useful for 2019 going forward?
Well, thank you very much, Kingsley. I know definitely some studies have, been done, and even when the policy in 2004 was announced, I remember that some of us had done copious analysis of the policy and then brought out the implications and made suggestions on what could be done to make the recapitalization program at that time, to yield the desired results. I remember very well, I did a copious analysis, and the findings, were published serialized in a number of newspapers in Nigeria, including The Guardian, in which I drew attention to the fact that a recapitalization, huge capital base, for banks is very important. But that, I think I concluded that it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for the continued financial health, of banks. In other words, that banks can have huge capital base, but if many other factors were not taken cognizance of and addressed, then the huge capital base may not solve the kind of problems that were observed at that time. In other words, that a bank would have huge capital base, but if you have a reckless and inept management, it will squander the huge capital base and the bank could fail. And it appeared that advice, was not really heeded at that time. That's the reason why perhaps some years later, the banks, even though recapitalized, all had a minimum of 25 billion capital base, you found that, unsoundness, resurfaced. That was observed during the era of Governor, Sanusi, Emir Sanusi, and that was the reason why some form of restructuring was done, during his, tenure. In other words, the lessons that could have been learned from such recapitalization is the need to accompany the recapitalization program with appropriate measures to address numerous factors that tend to cause ill health to banks. But it appeared that such factors have not really been addressed over time. So, and that's the reason why we still have, from time to time, symptoms of ill health of banks. And to the extent that some of them had to be merged during Governor Sanusi's era. And last year, we found a situation whereby one of the banks was so unsound that it had negative capital base, negative capital. And the central bank took a decisive, very decisive action to protect depositors by getting a new bank out of that existing bank. So invariably, there are always lessons that are learned from programs and policy implementation like the one we have. But then is the will there to actually do the right thing such that capital alone is not seen as the panacea for the problems of banks. Definitely is not the panacea. We must take cognizance of issues, in management, fraud in the banking system, irresponsible behavior on the part of some members of the boards and management. And of course, we also have, phenomena like internal and external shocks, unstable economic policies and conditions. Then, of course, if we tend to liberalize entry so much, then definitely that in itself creates problems. I know that's one of the issues one of the speakers mentioned, perhaps to liberalize. But liberalization, free entry, may not really be the solution of the problem. While we aim for optimal number of banks, making the number so large that they are uncontrollable, and then you now create an opportunity for distress in the system, that will not be permissible. So I will want a situation whereby the central bank would aim at an optimal number of banks that can exist in the Nigerian economy without hurting various stakeholders, depositors, investors, and so on.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Banda. We'll get back to you again and in the course of the discussion. But at this point, let's take a break, and when we return, there are already reactions from our viewer. Join us at NTAGMN is the Twitter handle. We'll just keep them coming. We'll take a look at some of the ones that have come in the time being once we get back from this break.
Won't kill you. Move now. Today, disobey traffic law, they cause accidents. Me, I don't talk, say, I no go dey do am again, because change begins with me.
I will no longer endanger my life crossing the express. Instead, I will use the bridge, because change begins with me.
Oga driver, stop this bus now, won't come down. I be one carry me pass where they go.
Make they stop anyhow for road, they cause traffic wahala and accidents. So I go they stop for the right bus stop, because change begins with me.
Change begins with me.
This message is brought to you by the National Orientation Agency in conjunction with the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
All right, welcome back from that short break, and it's still Good Morning Nigeria live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. As my colleague Blessing did indicate, we have a number of tweets that have come in. Let's quickly take some of them and then return to our guests. Ify, that is a Twitter handle. It's also at Eagle Square 2006. Same banks that are starving development and growth with their blatant refusal to give out loans to sole proprietors and entrepreneurs at single digits. he forgot that once the people stopped investing, growth would disappear.
Law Alpha C tweets, recapitalization of banks is a welcome development in order for us to know the health status of these institutions in view of many negative experiences.
Sani Michael Amakoje tweets, now, because of inflation that has set in over time, a need for recapitalization is definitely the way to go. However, what alternative job placements do we have? As some banks that might not meet the new capital adequacy requirements might fold up and also lay off staff. We don't have the opportunity, then another doom looms.
Akeju Olagbaji tweets, it sends wrong signals to vulnerable customers in getting the desired services. For me, it is not a must that all banks must be capable to undertake large transactions. What is important is the specific services tailored to meet the needs of customers. And those are the reactions we have gotten for the time being.
Yeah, well, let's return to Dr. Abdallah, Zubair Abdallah in our Kaduna Network Center. Dr. Abdallah, of course, you've also had the opportunity of listening to the other guests. I just wanted to play up again some of the points that were made in the past. After the consolidation exercise of 2005, there were complaints that it didn't seem to have been fair, that some parts of the country were denied the opportunity and that the mergers and acquisitions that occurred simply just gave room to raiders, corporate raiders who swallowed up the small banks, and then the economy got consolidated further in the hands of a section or just one or two sections of the country. What's your reaction, and how might this be obviated in 2019 if the new CBN proposal starts rolling?
The issue of some sort of one region have an advantage over the other in terms of the emergence of new banks, newly recapitalized banks during Soludo's time, to me, is not the issue. The issue is truly that of, one, after the recapitalization, what happened? Banks went from office to office, begging salary workers to come and take loans. Even when they were unwilling, they were craftily persuaded to do that. So they applied, and some of these applications were not critically evaluated to assess the capacity of the potential borrowers to pay. That is one. And secondly, when eventually the loans were disbursed, there was no cooperative governance exerted in terms of following up, especially in the private sector, in terms of following up to ensure that the resources were spent for the purpose they were meant to be spent on. And over time, it was almost inevitable. I sat down and looked at it at that time, and I said, there is going to be a problem. No critical credit assessment, no exercise of corporate governance, and banks were just dishing out money. And like one of the discussants says, they squandered the capital sooner than later. And bad debts began to mount. Stress began to appear in the banking system. And then there was another need for either another round of recapitalization or some alternative way of getting the banking system to behave. So these are some of the central issues, sir. It is frivolous for me to sit down here and start talking about why is it that the North ended up with only one or two banks and the South ended up with many. We have many people who have the money in the North to invest in banks, but perhaps due to cultural or religious factors, they may not be interested in investing in banks because of usury problems, religious problems, I mean. Some people are not too comfortable even being paid interest or paying interest. So the window for, that could have been seized in acquiring or investing in new banks was lost, not because of the incapacity or lack of money across the Niger. No, it was more because of other cultural factors and the lack of interest. If you take a census of the people who invest in the capital markets, you will see that a lot of the northerners are investing in capital markets because their religion and culture agrees with investing in business. But investing in a bank is something else. Remember, even the renowned Dangote once operated a bank, and then a few years along the line, he changed his mind. He focused more attention on other things, especially solid production. So please, I am not one of those who want to delve into discussing as to why or why not there is a kind of disparity in the ownership of banks between the North and the South. I don't feel we were disadvantaged up here in the North. I feel that our people were just disinclined. They were not comfortable, some of them, in investing in banks. Rather, they would rather go and build flour mills, cement companies, and the like. Real production. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Abdallah. Back to us in the studio. Professor Owaleke, every one of you have raised your different concerns, and it will appear, okay, it's not just in what is the capital base now, but management issue, risk, or poor risk management, as well as some other indices that you have pointed out. Where and how should the CBN undertake what it's proposing based on what you have raised?
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, I want to recognize that, yes, concentration in the banking industry, a situation where you have just a few banks, dominating, has its own challenges, and one of which is the issue of, systemic importance. The chances that if something happens to one bank, there could be a contagion. It could also affect, the other banks, and then the economy will, could go down. So I agree with that, with that position, that there could be systemic risk. But that does not remove the fact that recapitalization, as has been rightly pointed out, is a necessary condition. It may not be sufficient, but it's a necessary condition. I don't subscribe to the idea of lowering the, entry barriers to the banking sector. Yes, I agree that the structure, if you move the structure from the monopolistic nature to, say, oligopolistic, where you just have a few, you remove competition, and that could also affect the kind of prices we get from the banking, sector. I was discussing with a friend recently in connection with this, and the person was telling me, why is the CBN governor, talking about recapitalization, a few years after we had the other one, whether is he looking for, some job to do or what? That the central bank should have faced the challenges in the banking sector. He talked about insider abuses, talked about, excess charges, unauthorized deductions and so on. And I looked at him and I said, these are even the justifications for the recapitalization, the proposed recapitalization. Because by recapitalizing, okay, what you do is to change the ownership structure of the banking sector. You move it away from family-owned, more or less. You widen it further. And what that does is that it helps to reduce the preponderance of insider abuses, the overexposure to directors, for example, and shareholders with significant interest. Significant interest is defined as a shareholder having more than 5%. of the shares. So by the time you have big banks with diversified ownership structure, it helps in corporate governance. So many of the corporate governance issues, as I mentioned earlier, are usually associated with family-owned banks. And that is why, again, I will not agree to the view that we have to open our banking space to the point where we can begin to have family-owned banks. Even now, as we speak, I think the structure, you could say, is also risk-based in the sense that we have national banks, we also have regional banks. Wema Bank, for example, is not, to the best of my knowledge, is still licensed as a regional bank. So that tiered level, is also recognized. And we have microfinance banks. Recently, the central bank is talking about using Nistral Microfinance Bank, to be sure that there is easier access to credit. But what is important again to note is that banking is no more in an era of where brick and mortar is emphasized, where you must have banks all over the place, especially now that the central bank is trying to emphasize digital modes of transaction. So we need few banks that will be in a position to deploy some of this, technology to ensure, better and easier access to credit. So what we need to do now is for the central bank to step up, monitoring and supervision. If you look at the prudential guidelines of 2010, for me, it's very comprehensive. Risk management, corporate governance, very comprehensive. It is for the central bank to put in place measures, consumer protection and the rest of them, to implement, what is there. So step up both on-site and off-site supervision of banks. And that will be easier if the banks are fewer in number. If you have so many banks, it creates more problems for the central bank. Even monetary policy transmission becomes also, a challenge for the central bank. Where you have fragmentation of banks in the economy.
Yeah, Professor Waluke, if you recall, before 2004, that was one of the excuses given, that the banks were too fragmented, there were too many, and CBN didn't seem to have the adequate personnel to undertake monitoring and supervision. Yes. It is something almost 90 banks at the time. Now they are 25 or thereabout, because you have some newer banks that have come up since the consolidation exercise. I'd like us to return to Johnson Chukwu in our Lagos Network Center. Mr. Chukwu, earlier, Professor Waluke did say that the major routes to recapitalization, if it becomes a policy of a central bank, will be through M&A, as well as the stock market. M&A, of course, for our viewers, that stands for mergers and acquisition. Tell us something. Professor Waluke says that it might help to reawaken and then deepen the capital market. The picture in 2004 isn't exactly the same picture that we have now in 2019, following the interregnum that lasted almost a decade, when the capital market went flat, as it were. And a number of these banks, some of them have, in a sense, the equivalent of what you might refer to as penny stocks. Might this be a good time, therefore, to open up the banking sector for recapitalization through, for instance, the capital market?
If the central bank comes up with a capital-based requirement that is beyond the current shareholders' funds of existing banks, then the banks will have to look for funding sources. One of the options that will be available to them is the capital market. You may see some of them coming to the capital market to do public offers. But you also have to gauge the level of economic activity in the country today. And if you have to do a direct comparison between 2004 and 2019, and in 2004, the economy was growing at more than 6%. We're dealing with an economy that is actually struggling at barely 2%. We saw a lot of investor confidence in 2004. Today, we have weak investor confidence in the capital market. So in as much as the capital market will present an opportunity for investment by any company that has a good offer proposal to investors, then the robustness we had in 2004 is not there today. Some of the banks that have value proposition will come to the market and raise money. Some others may not, just like what happened in 2004, where some banks tried to raise money in the capital market, but they couldn't get investors because they didn't have any value propositions to make. But I also must mention something. When you talk of raising additional capital, you have to look at return on equity. Today, the average return on equity among the top 6 banks is about 15%, although we have an outliner like GTBank that has a return on equity of about 32%. So investors that are going to invest in new shares of these companies will recognize that there will be dilution in earnings, and the return on equity may not be as much as we are getting currently. So that might be a disincentive for investment in additional shares. Also, consider the fact that, I mean, when one of my colleagues over there was speaking, he said that the banks went about hawking credit because the economy did not expand as much as their capital base had expanded. So if the economy fails to expand, the banks will be goaded or compelled to begin to advance credit to sub-credit borrowers or borrower with weak credit history. And that will lead to an increase in the incidence of non-performing loans. Of course, we know the shortest route to bank failure is non-performing loans. So in as much as you're going to look at the capital market opportunity to invest, to raise capital, but then the expansion in the general economy may be strong enough as to create opportunities for an increase in the earnings of the bank that are raising additional capital. If there's not such increase in the size of the economy, then the additional capital will be sub-optimized. They won't have outlets to invest in those additional capital, and that will lead to a depression in their earnings. So basic thing is this. When you talk of the size of the banking industry or the banks, you also have to deal with the size of the economy. No expansion in the economy, you're going to have high incidence of non-performing loans. That's, if you look at even what happened later to the financial crisis, it was the issue of what we call subprime mortgage loans, where the American banks had actually exhausted the opportunities for those who have strong credit and began to lend to those weak credit records, and those ones defaulted. That's exactly what happened in the country in 2006, 2007, and 2008 that led to the banking crisis, where banks advanced so much credit to people who had no capacity to pay. And then those credits failed, and then the banks suffered liquidity crisis that led to the intervention of the central bank, which couldn't even lead to the failure or the exit of a number of those so-called consolidated banks. And like I mentioned earlier, when the consolidation took place in 2004, 2005, the then CBN governor said the banking industry has consolidated to the extent that none of the banks can fail. But we saw failures as a result of high incidence on non-performing loans, weak governance standards, weak supervisory standards. So, in effect, the banks can raise money if they can maintain their current earnings, or they can actually up their earnings. That can only happen if the economy is expanding. If the economy is shrinking, they won't have the opportunity to expand their earnings. And if they do not come with a proposal that shows that return on equity will still remain strong or even be stronger, investors will not buy those shares. Investors will only buy shares that promise good returns on equity. And that's very core on where the banks can raise money. So we have to look at the totality of how we want to raise money. And my approach has always been, let's have a risk-based capital base. Currently, we have the regional banks that require about 10 billion share capital, and 15 billion share capital, that have cash reserve ratio, cash capital adequacy ratio of 10%. We have the national banks that require 25 billion in shareholders fund and capital adequacy ratio of 10%. Then you have the national bank, the international banks that have capital adequacy ratio of 15%. And then you have the systemically important banks that require capital adequacy ratio of 16%. The capital adequacy ratio would measure the capacity of the banks to meet its obligations. And for me, if you use that as a criteria, you will set threshold for banks at different categories. And you have banks that cut across different levels of capitalization.
Mr. Johnson Chukwu, thank you very much there for your analysis. And very briefly, let's return to Professor Mike Obadan. Professor Mike Obadan, one of our tweets did reference this issue, and we're coming back to it again. Well, you recapitalize banks to enable them to take on big projects, but the issue has always been lending to the real sector. And you're finding the central bank now doing some of the jobs that the commercial banks ordinarily should be doing. Will recapitalization, if undertaken from 2019 onwards, change the orientation of commercial banks in Nigeria to lend to the real sector and indeed those who are in a position to contribute to the growth and development of the economy?
Thank you very much, Kingsley, for that important observation. let me say that recapitalization will not necessarily change the attitude or orientation of the deposit money banks to lend to the real sector of the economy. It can, spur them in a way to the extent that they have adequate capital base. But importantly, what will need to be done to spur them to lend to the real sectors of the economy, the central bank is already taking some measures in that regard, because a good number of the banks are currently hobbled by a sizable proportion of non-performing loans, inability to get their money back from those who borrowed money, and then inability to even realize the collaterals. And the central bank has considered numerous measures to help in recovering loans, and also in ensuring that only people who are credible can borrow money. And once the various measures which the central bank is putting in place and implementing are in place, then definitely the commercial banks may be encouraged to start lending to real sectors. In other words, once the phenomenon of non-performing loans is seriously, substantially addressed, and new loans are repaid as and when due, and if they are not being repaid, the banks are able to realize the collaterals, then definitely that one will help. But on its own, large amount of capital will not spur them, not likely to spur them to lend more to the real sectors of the economy. What can further be done would be to use moral suasion continuously, which the central bank is already doing, to encourage them, and also to take measures, to block channels which they are now putting money into instead of lending money the real sectors of the economy. For example, their active involvement in investing in government securities, which has adverse effect on the loans which they advance. Central bank at the last monetary policy, after the last monetary policy committee meeting, announced measures in that regard. So such measures that are being implemented by the central bank are complementing the proposed enhanced capital base, may reorientate the commercial banks to move in the direction of performing their traditional functions, are trying to achieve their traditional mandate of financial intermediation, lending to the real sectors of the economy to aid growth and development of the economy.
Professor of Economics and also member Central Bank of Nigeria Monetary Policy Committee, Professor Mike Obano, thank you very much for your insight. You joined us from our Benin studio. I also like to thank Professor Uche Waleke, Chairman, Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria, Abuja branch. Thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure.
Appreciation also to Mr. Johnson Chukwu, financial analyst. You joined us from our Lagos studio. And we also like to appreciate Dr. Zubair Tajo Abdullah of the Department of Economics at Kaduna State University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insight. Okay, let's take a look at sports this morning.